At first, Ruby Marie Murray's death looked like an isolated tragedy. And one 8-month-old child. A quiet home. Parents who claimed they didn't notice anything was wrong. Investigators focused where they always do. The immediate caregivers. The last people who saw her alive. But as the case unfolded, something unexpected surfaced. Not evidence. Not a confession. A name. A name that had already been tied to children who disappeared. To beliefs that turned neglect into justification. To deaths explained away as destiny. That name was Chad Daybell. He was not charged in Ruby's case. He did not live in that house. He did not touch that child. And yet his name kept appearing in the background, like a shadow that didn't belong to the room, but was somehow still there. For some viewers, the name meant nothing. For others, it triggered an immediate sense of dread. Because Chad Daybell's name is not associated with one tragedy, but with a pattern. A pattern where belief becomes authority. Where children are redefined. And where death is no longer treated as loss, but as a transition. This is not a video about rumors. This is not a video about coincidence. And this is not a video meant to shock you. This is a video about context. About how one man's ideas didn't end with his arrest, but continued to echo in places no one thought to look. Before you can understand why Chad Daybell's name appears in stories involving children, neglect, and silence, you need to understand who he was. And more importantly, how someone so ordinary became so dangerous. This is the story behind the name you keep hearing. Chad never presented himself as a leader. He positioned himself as a messenger. Someone who wasn't inventing truth, just receiving it. That distinction mattered, because when someone claims authority, you can question it. But when someone claims revelation, disagreement feels dangerous. In Rexburg, Chad was known as a family man, a religious author, a quiet believer. He wasn't scrutinized. He was trusted. No one was watching him closely. No one felt the need to. There were no police calls. No public breakdowns. No visible warning signs. And that absence of chaos made everything that followed harder to stop. Because when a man like Chad Daybell changes, people don't notice right away. Not when the shift happens privately. Not when belief evolves slowly. Not when the language stays calm. The most unsettling part? Chad didn't suddenly become someone else. He simply became more certain. And certainty, when left unchallenged, can turn faith into permission. Before anyone realized what Chad Daybell truly believed, he had already convinced people that he could see things they couldn't. To understand how Chad Daybell moved from quiet author to the center of one of America's most disturbing belief-driven crimes, we have to look at the stories he told. And what happened when he stopped treating them like fiction. Chad Daybell did not introduce his beliefs as doctrine. He introduced them as stories. He wrote religious fiction rooted in apocalyptic themes, visions of the end times, and a world divided between those who were chosen and those who were not. On the surface, these books looked harmless. They were sold as speculative narratives meant to inspire faith and preparedness. To an outsider, they appeared no different from other niche religious novels. But Chad did not treat these books as imagination. He spoke about them as if they were previews, as if the stories were not invented but revealed. He claimed the ideas came from visions, from moments when the veil between worlds was thin enough for him to see what others could not. In his worldview, the end of the world was not a metaphor. It was a schedule. Chad began describing people in spiritual terms that went far beyond traditional belief. He spoke of light and dark spirits. He claimed some individuals were no longer truly alive, that their bodies had been taken over by something else. He told people that a human being could still be walking, talking, and breathing, but already be spiritually dead. These were not ideas he shared publicly from a pulpit. They were shared quietly, in conversations, in private messages, in moments that felt intimate and trusted. And that is how belief spreads most effectively. Chad never said he was special. He implied it. He positioned himself as someone burdened with knowledge rather than empowered by it. He spoke with calm authority, never emotional, never dramatic. He made his listeners feel as though they were being let in on something important, something dangerous to misunderstand. Over time, the stories changed. They stopped being hypothetical. Chad began speaking about people he knew, assigning them spiritual labels: light, dark, redeemable, lost. In this system, morality became flexible. If someone was dark, then harm done to them was not cruelty. It was a correction. If someone was already spiritually gone, then their physical death was not murder, it was released. This belief removed the most important barrier in human behavior: the idea that life is sacred no matter what. Once that barrier is gone, anything can be justified. What made Chad Daybell especially dangerous was not the content of his beliefs alone, it was how ordinary he made them sound. He did not preach fear, he spoke in reassurance, he did not incite panic. He normalized inevitability. Death, in his framework, was not a tragedy, it was a transition. And when people accept that idea, suffering no longer feels urgent. Neglect no longer feels cruel. Silence no longer feels like complicity. This is how belief becomes authority, not through force, but through explanation, not through control, but through certainty. By the time Chad's inner circle fully accepted his worldview, the stories were no longer books on a shelf, they were instructions for how to see the people around them. And once that shift happens, reality becomes negotiable. Chad Daybell did not wake up one day and decide to cause harm. He created a system where harm no longer looked like harm at all. And systems like that do not stay contained. Chad Daybell's beliefs existed long before Lori Vallow entered his life, but belief on its own does not usually turn deadly. What transforms belief into action is reinforcement, agreement, someone who does not question the vision, but magnifies it. That is what Lori Vallow became. Lori was not drawn to Chad's ideas cautiously. She embraced them fully. Where others listened with curiosity, she responded with certainty. Where others hesitated, she leaned in. Chad did not need to persuade her that the world was divided between light and dark. She already believed it. Together, they did not balance each other. They accelerated each other. Lori reinforced Chad's sense of spiritual authority, treating his visions not as possibilities but as confirmations. She spoke of him as someone chosen, someone with access to knowledge others could not handle. In return, Chad validated Lori's own sense of importance, framing her as exceptional, exalted, and central to a divine plan. This was not a relationship built on doubt or grounding. It was built on escalation. They spoke openly about spiritual rankings, about people who were obstacles rather than individuals, about children and adults who were no longer fully human in their spiritual state. Language shifted. People became categories. Categories became problems. Problems, in their worldview, required solutions. And solutions did not always involve survival. Lori did not push Chad toward restraint. She pushed him toward inevitability. She embraced the idea that death could be purposeful, that removal could be righteous, that suffering could be spiritually necessary. Where Chad once framed death as transition, Lori framed it as alignment. Together, they created a closed system of belief. Outside voices were dismissed as blind or corrupt. Concern became persecution. Questions became proof that others could not see the truth. This is how isolation forms without walls. As their bond deepened, the tone of their belief hardened. What had once been framed as prophecy began to look like permission. What had once been described as vision began to function like instruction. And the people around them began to disappear. This was no longer about faith, it was about validation, about proving the belief system correct through action. Because once action is taken, doubt becomes unbearable. The belief must be right, or everything that follows becomes unforgivable. Chad and Lori did not experience their relationship as dangerous. They experienced it as destiny, as alignment, as confirmation that they were seeing the world clearly while everyone else was asleep. But belief that cannot tolerate contradiction does not remain theoretical for long. It demands outcome. And those outcomes would soon leave permanent evidence behind. The moment belief becomes action, consequences follow. Not symbolic ones, not spiritual ones, real ones, measured in absence, in silence, and eventually, in death. The deaths connected to Chad Daybell did not happen all at once. They unfolded in sequence, each one normalized by the belief that made the next easier to accept. The shift from belief to consequence did not happen suddenly. It happened step by step, each loss framed as acceptable, explainable, and spiritually justified. The first death was Tammy Daybell. Tammy was Chad Daybell's wife, a mother, a woman known in her community as reliable and ordinary. In October 2019, she died suddenly in her sleep. At first, her death was not treated as suspicious. She had been described as having health issues. There was no immediate autopsy, no immediate investigation. Her passing was accepted quietly, but acceptance does not mean truth. As time passed, details began to surface that did not align with a peaceful natural death. Tammy had expressed fear in the weeks before she died. There were reports of a masked man with a gun near the home. There were sudden changes, unexplained events, and a rapid remarriage that followed her death. Tammy Daybell's death would later be ruled a homicide. Not long after Tammy's death, 2 children disappeared. J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan were last seen in September 2019. At first, their absence was explained away. They were said to be staying with friends or relatives. School officials raised concerns. Family members asked questions. Authorities were told the children were safe. They were not. As months passed, the explanations grew thinner. The children were not seen, not heard from, not enrolled in school. Their absence became impossible to ignore. When investigators finally focused on Chad Daybell's property, the truth could no longer be buried by belief. The remains of J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan were found buried on Chad Daybell's land. The discovery was not symbolic, it was physical, it was undeniable, it was final. What made these deaths especially disturbing was not only the act itself, but the language surrounding them. In the belief system Chad and Lori shared, the children had been labeled as dark, as no longer themselves, as vessels that had already been taken over. That language mattered. Because once a child is no longer seen as a child, protection disappears, care becomes optional, survival becomes negotiable. The pattern was now visible, not chaos, but sequence, not impulse, but ideology. Tammy Daybell's death removed an obstacle. The children's deaths removed responsibility. Each loss was followed by justification rather than grief, explanation rather than panic, calm rather than remorse. This was not a moment of madness. It was the outcome of a system that had already decided who mattered and who did not. By the time the public understood what had happened, the damage was irreversible. Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow were arrested. Trials followed, evidence was presented. Beliefs that once sounded abstract were laid bare in courtrooms, translated into actions and outcomes that could no longer be spiritualized away. Chad Daybell was convicted for his role in the deaths connected to him. Lori Vallow was also found guilty. But conviction does not undo influence. Those ideas did not originate with Chad Daybell, and they did not disappear with his arrest. They existed in communities, families, and belief circles long before his name became known to the public. His case simply exposed where that thinking can lead when left unchecked. In Ruby Marie Murray's case, the danger was not spectacle, it was quiet. It was routine. It was ordinary. The kind of harm that grows in environments where belief replaces accountability and suffering is interpreted rather than addressed. This is why Chad Daybell's name becomes relevant in discussions like this. not as an explanation, and not as a scapegoat, but as a reference point. A known example of how certain belief structures can normalize harm long before anyone intervenes. There is no accusation here, no implication of instruction, no claim of direct involvement, only context. Context that helps explain how a child can be lost in plain sight, how warning signs can be rationalized, how extreme neglect can exist without the people closest to it believing they are doing wrong. Chad Daybell's case matters because it provides a framework for understanding these dynamics. It shows what happens when belief is allowed to outrank empathy and certainty replaces care. The connection is not a line drawn between two cases. It is a pattern that emerges when the same conditions exist. And patterns are what true crime exists to examine. Because, without understanding the conditions that allow harm to happen, we are left reacting to tragedy instead of recognizing it. This episode was never meant to accuse, it was meant to clarify, to explain why one name keeps resurfacing when children are harmed and belief is used as explanation instead of intervention. In the final moments, we step back and ask why stories like this continue to repeat, even after the perpetrators are convicted. Chad Daybell's story is often remembered for its most shocking details: the graves, the trials, the sentences handed down in courtrooms. But focusing only on the ending misses what made it possible. This was not a story driven by rage or chaos. It was driven by certainty, by the quiet confidence that belief alone could justify decisions that no one else would accept. Chad Daybell did not need to threaten anyone. He did not need to force compliance. His danger came from explanation, from language that reframed harm as purpose and loss as transition. That is why his name continues to surface in conversations about child neglect, belief-driven harm, and silence. Not because he is everywhere, but because the conditions that allowed his beliefs to operate still exist. This episode was not meant to connect unrelated tragedies or assign blame where it does not belong. It was meant to provide context, to show how ideas, when left unchallenged, can move quietly from one environment to another. Most people involved in these stories did not believe they were doing evil. They believed they were doing what was necessary, what was justified, what was right, and that belief is what makes these cases so difficult to prevent. Because danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives calmly, wrapped in certainty, and asks for trust instead of scrutiny. The loss of children like J.J. Vallow, Tylee Ryan, and Ruby Marie Murray forces a question that has no comfortable answer. How many warning signs do we explain away because they do not look like danger? How often do we mistake belief for morality? And how many tragedies continue, not because no one cared, but because no one questioned what they were told to believe? This story does not end with a verdict. It lingers in the systems that failed to intervene, the language that normalized harm, and the silence that allowed it to continue. In the next episode, we examine the beliefs themselves, how faith, when stripped of accountability, can become something unrecognizable. Because the most dangerous ideas are not the loud ones. They are the ones that sound reasonable. If you want to understand how belief became a weapon in this case, the next episode breaks it down. Subscribe to continue the series.